They say the bells tolled for the dead each morning, yet no one spoke of the names. The sound drifted across London like a knell for the forgotten, a hollow voice rising above empty streets where shutters were nailed shut and doors marked with red crosses. Smoke lingered in the air, pungent with burning herbs, meant to chase the pestilence but carrying only the stench of fear. The city had become a place where silence grew heavier than the clamor of life, where neighbors vanished overnight, and where whispers turned sharp and dangerous. Some spoke of the plague as God's judgment, others of witches at work. And always, somewhere in the murmur of the fearful, surfaced the name of a foreign prince long dead, Vlad, who impaled his enemies and left them swaying like grotesque monuments to terror. They said England's cruelty was not its own invention, but a shadow borrowed from darker lands. The summer of 1665 pressed its weight upon the city with relentless cruelty. Heat thickened the stench of the dead, and carts creaked through the alleys, piled high with bodies shrouded in linen. Children peered from cracks in shutters, their eyes wide, their breath muffled. Priests moved like black birds, whispering hurried prayers and scrawling final benedictions over men and women who had drawn their last breath in crowded rooms. Rats slipped between cobblestones, as much a part of the living city as the market cries that no longer came. In the midst of all this, fear had 1,000 faces. It was not only the sickness that haunted the people but suspicion, an invisible contagion of its own. Women who brewed herbs to ease the fever were spat upon in the streets. A cough might earn a neighbor's curse, a sidelong glance might end in accusation. The plague had stripped away reason, and in its place, superstition and cruelty blossomed like weeds. It was said witches summoned the sickness, that midwives whispered charms into the ears of the dying, that some women courted death itself. The flames of justice, the magistrate swore, could purify even this pestilence. And Weaver moved carefully through this broken world, her steps measured, her face wrapped in a faded veil against the thick air. She was a midwife, a widow since the winter past, and her work had once brought her respect. Now it was her undoing. She had delivered babies into homes where, within weeks, mothers lay cold beneath linen shrouds. She had been seen with herbs in her satchel, whispering prayers over fevers. To some, she was a blessing, to others, she was a curse made flesh. By her side often walked her daughter, Eleanor, a girl no more than 12, clutching a small book bound with leather scraps. Eleanor had begun writing the names of the dead, neighbors, friends, even strangers carried through the lanes. She scribbled quickly and secretly, as though afraid the silence of the city might swallow them whole. Her pale eyes carried a strange clarity, as though she already knew history would try to erase what she witnessed. For mother and daughter, survival was a fragile thread. Each knock on their door threatened to sever it. Each whisper on the street felt like a noose tightening around their throats. The inevitable came one evening when a nobleman's household fell ill after and had been called to tend his wife. The woman died, and soon whispers swelled into accusation. Men arrived with papers stamped by the city magistrate, and neighbors pressed forward as though the spectacle itself were a kind of deliverance. Eleanor clung to her mother's skirts as and was pulled into the street. Her veil was torn from her face, and the crowd hissed like serpents. They said she had brought death into the noble's house. They said she had consorted with the devil, her hands stained with unnatural power. When she cried out, her words were lost in the cacophony of voices. They bound her hands and dragged her to the hall where justice was said to be done. But there was no justice in that chamber. The magistrates, their faces stern and satisfied, demanded confessions more than they sought truth. They asked of charms, of pacts signed in blood, of midnight gatherings beneath the moon. When and spoke of nothing but childbirth and prayer, they called it defiance. They turned her silence into guilt. Witnesses rose, trembling but eager, to claim they had seen her shadow linger at their windows, that they had heard whispers in the wind when she passed. The fevered imagination of a terrified people was made into evidence, and the gavel fell like the swing of an axe. Public punishment was spectacle, and London's citizens gathered for it as they once gathered for fairs. Children clambered onto shoulders, vendors whispered behind closed shutters, and the air trembled with a cruel anticipation. And was forced upon the platform, her hands bound, her eyes searching the crowd for her daughter. Eleanor stood at the edge, her small book pressed to her chest, her face drained of color. The punishment was not swift, nor merciful. Words of condemnation were read aloud, and the magistrates reminded the crowd of horrors beyond England's shores. Tales of Vlad the Impaler spread like kindling among them, how he had raised forests of the dead, how his enemies had writhed upon stakes until their breath gave out. The magistrates spoke of such cruelties not with horror but as if they lent authority to their own. If such savagery could purge a kingdom abroad, then England, too, might learn from it. Fear twisted into resolve, and cruelty was dressed in righteousness. Anne's cries were lost beneath the shouts, her face pale against the setting sun. And when the act was done, when her body was left broken, the crowd dispersed with a strange satisfaction, as if they had cleansed themselves of pestilence by spilling the blood of one woman. Eleanor was never seen among the crowds again. Some said she vanished into the countryside, carrying her little book of names with her. Others claimed she, too, fell ill and was carried away by the plague's cart. No records remained. The magistrates spoke no further of Anne Weaver, and her daughter's writings were never found. It was as though the city itself conspired to swallow them, to bury their existence in silence. And yet, on certain nights when the bells toll and the streets lie empty, there are whispers of a child who recorded every death until her hand shook and her ink ran dry. They say she wrote not only of plague but of cruelty, of trials carried out in darkness, of punishments borrowed from distant lands where Vlad's shadow still loomed. But history is a jealous keeper. Some truths rot in silence, as if England itself wished to forget. And so their names, like so many others, slipped quietly into the dust, carried away on the tolling of the bells, remembered only by the echo of what was never written again. By 1692, the whispers that once haunted England had crossed the ocean. The tolling bells of plague-stricken London were now replaced by the clang of iron church bells in Massachusetts, their sound echoing through frozen fields and narrow wooden lanes. Fear had survived the voyage, stowed away in memory and superstition, and it blossomed in the austere soil of Salem village. Here, the pestilence was not disease but the devil himself, stalking through barns and hearths, crouching behind every quarrel between neighbors. The Puritans, bound by scripture and suspicion, believed themselves a chosen people, yet their faith was sharpened by dread. And into this dread came the same shadows that had darkened England, the fear of witches, the hunger for blame, and the cruel stories of foreign cruelties that justified unimaginable acts. Vlad's name was whispered here too, half remembered from English lips, invoked as proof that terror had always been the weapon of righteousness. The village itself was a hard place, hewn from forest and frost. Houses of stern timber lined the muddy road, their windows shuttered against both storm and suspicion. The fields stretched gray and lifeless beneath the cold, and in the distance, black pines clawed at the winter sky. Smoke drifted from chimneys, thin and uncertain, as though even fire feared to take root. Men labored with eyes narrowed against neighbors, for land disputes simmered beneath their piety, and grudges found easy fuel in the language of sin. In the meeting house, the ministers thundered against the devil's encroachment, their voices filling the silence with dread. Women bent their heads in prayer, whispering not only for salvation but for protection from the invisible snares of evil. Children watched and listened, their innocence molded by fear, their imaginations fertile ground for visions. Salem was a village split in two, faith and fear, devotion and division, piety and paranoia. And in that divide, justice would lose its way. Sarah Good walked those roads as if the earth itself turned against her. She was poor, her clothes patched and fraying, her hands cracked from cold and labor. Widowhood and poverty made her a convenient target, her very survival an offense to those who deemed themselves blessed. She begged for bread at doors that shut swiftly, muttering under her breath when refused, and those mutterings were soon said to be curses. Her eyes, hollow with hunger, were painted as wicked, her sorrow mistaken for malice. Watching her with both awe and terror was young Mercy Paris, the minister's daughter, a child caught between obedience and curiosity. Mercy had seen Sarah in the lanes, bent beneath her burden, speaking words no one cared to hear. To the child's mind, hungry for stories and trembling from sermons, Sarah became both pitiful and dangerous, a living emblem of the evil her father thundered against. When the accusations began, Mercy's small voice trembled in the chorus, uncertain yet swallowed whole by the tide. The trials unfurled like a fever spreading through the veins of the village. The meeting house was crammed with bodies, breath clouding in the cold air, eyes wide and hungry for spectacle. Girls screamed and writhed, claiming spirits pinched and clawed them. The judges, stern-faced in their black robes, listened with grave approval, their questions sharpened like blades. Sarah stood among them, her frailty magnified by the harsh wooden walls, her protests drowned by the shrill cries of children. Neighbors rose to speak against her, eager to deflect suspicion from themselves, their stories weaving a net from which she could not escape. beneath it all hummed the cruel wisdom carried across the ocean, that terror was a tool, that mercy was weakness, that righteousness demanded harshness. Some even whispered of Vlad's cruelties, tales told by old Englishmen who claimed justice was proven only by fear. If forests of impaled enemies could keep a land pure, then surely the gallows could keep Salem safe. And so cruelty became a sermon, and mercy was lost. Sarah Good was condemned though her hands were empty of sin. The ministers prayed, the judges declared, and the people nodded with grim relief. She was led away to her fate, her small figure swallowed by the crowd, her voice fading beneath the clamor. Others followed her path, neighbors, wives, daughters, even children, swept into the tide of accusations until records faltered and graves lay unmarked. Some vanished altogether, their names erased, their resting places never known. The silence of the forest became their tomb, the cold New England earth their unmarked stone. Mercy Paris watched from her father's house, her young heart burdened by the weight of what she had seen, by the screams she had echoed, by the truth she would never speak. She grew in shadow, her memory a haunted echo, her silence a darker inheritance than sin itself. The forest swallowed their screams, and history sealed the silence. Those who vanished left no trace but whispers, their stories folded into the hush of trees and the stillness of unmarked soil. Salem moved on, the fields thawed, the bells rang, and the village cloaked its shame in prayer. But not a single page in the kingdom's history dared to mention her name again.